We're joined today by country music historian Tony Russell. We're talking about his latest book, Vintage Country, the essential artists and songs from old time to honky-tonk, 1920 to 1970. Tony, thank you so much for joining me today.
No, not at all. It's a pleasure.
Well, you have a new book out here, Vintage Country, the essential artists and songs from old time to honky-tonk, 1920 to 1970. It's all there in the title, but can you tell the listeners a bit about the new book?
Well, I started writing it, Dustin, in 2023, which, as you'll remember, was the centenary year for country music. It was in June 1923 that Fiddlin' John Carson stepped up to a microphone in an improvised studio in Atlanta and recorded Little Old Log Cabin in the Lane, which is generally agreed by everybody who's interested in the subject to be the first ever country song put on a record by a country artist. Country is a baggy term, and you could have fights with academics about whether it's country music or traditional music or folk music. But for our purposes, the bag is a wide one, and country can encompass all the things we're going to be talking about, I hope.
Sure.
And so it struck me then that at this point, country music actually has 100 years of history to look back over. And I thought, well, this would be something nice to commemorate in a book that not just specialists, I hope, will want to read, but people who are just, whose curiosity has been piqued by hearing this record or that, or this artist in performance or that. And so I'll come up with a sort of gazetteer, if you like, of the first half of that century. My area of competence, I'm fairly clear about this. From 1920 to 1970, I know my way around. From 1970, maybe for a couple more decades, I can find my way, gropingly. And for the more recent years in country music, I'm kind of watching at a distance. So I stuck to what I know about. And also I thought, there's plenty of people writing about, I don't know, Luke Bryan, but there are probably not that many people writing about Ernest Stoneman anymore. And so I wanted to put in a word for these guys who were in many cases extraordinarily influential. They were founder figures. They are the people that shaped what we call country music. And I wanted to show readers how that was done.
Well, you've definitely done an amazing job, and I wanted to ask you a bit about that, putting the book together. I know you obviously hit the big names of the past 100 years, but there are a lot of artists who I imagine there's probably not a lot of info out there about them now.
No, and that's, for anyone who's inclined towards researching obscure stuff, as I am, this is a huge temptation, of course, because, there's plenty you can read about Jimmy Rogers and the Carter family and Uncle Dave Macon. But there's a lot less to read about Kelly Harrell or Chris Bouchelon, or Cowboy Copas to come a little more recently. And I enjoy the challenge of finding out what isn't generally known or what was once known and put in a fanzine in 1944, but nobody has written about since, and hauling it back into the light so that people can see, especially what people at the time thought of them. I mean, it's all very well me passing my judgments about how I feel about Kelly Harrell, but it's really interesting reading people at the time greeting a new recording by this guy in 1926, this wonderful singer from Southern Virginia, who is just one of the great ballad singers and narrative song specialists of the early years of country music. And so that's also, it gives the book a texture, I think, that in between the people you've heard about, there are people whom I hope intriguingly you haven't heard about, but you'd like to hear about. And that's the service I'm hoping to provide.
Well, Tony, I know you've been writing about country music for a long time. I recognized your name from some of the old Bear Family compilations. What led you to becoming a historian here of country music?
Well, when I first started getting interested in country music, an unconscionably long time ago, in England, where, as you can tell, I am from, it was very difficult. There were very few. I mean, I'm talking about old-time country music. I mean, even bluegrass was quite hard to find in this country, and that was at the time I was first listening. That was a contemporary music. But for old times stuff, there were a few records of Jimmy Rogers and the Carter Family, and I think one album of Uncle Dave Macon. And if you wanted to find out what else was around or had been around in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, you had to start reading specialist magazines and digging around and asking people who had been interested in this music longer than you had. And, that was a challenge. People often say this these days, but it is, I think, true that when all information is available at a keystroke on a computer, that sense of discovery that you get when you really have to fight your way to a fact through meetings and letters to people. This is before email, remember. You really feel if you uncovered something that you didn't know about a relatively obscure artist, it took some doing, and you felt pleased with yourself when you'd finished doing it.
Sure.
And that kind of excitement, I think, has rather disappeared when you can find it, as I say, all so easily. Except that the part of the great opportunity that has been opened by the internet is that you can go deeply into areas where it would have been impossible for me in England, and pretty difficult for anyone even in the United States to go. If you wanted to research some of the people I'm interested in, you would have to go to every county library in a state in the hope of finding local newspapers which might or might not have been preserved, which might or might not have had articles about these people. Now, with a keystroke on a computer and access to a newspaper archive site, you can find all this stuff wherever you are in the world, in seconds. And that's a resource I've drawn on very often in writing Vintage Country.
Well, and because of the way things are now, you're able to find a lot of the music as well. I love that you have an essential recordings list for, the readers who maybe don't know a lot about or they're not familiar with these artists. And, you can probably go on YouTube or someplace and find a lot of this stuff now.
You can, yes. That was, from the very outset, that was an essential principle of the book, that I wasn't so bothered about what people thought about what I was writing about these people, though I would like the biographical detail to be useful at least. But I did want to give them a starter pack of music. So there are anything from 4 or 5 to 8 so-called key tracks or essential recordings, which will just selected to give an impression of the breadth of the artist's repertoire, the different styles he or she might have had. And that adds up over the book to somewhere between 500 and 600 essential recordings. And I think if you work your way, and I hope it isn't hard work, through those, you will have a pretty good basic knowledge of what old-time music consisted of, and you will know whether you like it or not.
Definitely. Again, Tony Russell's with us, and we're talking about his new book, Vintage Country, The Essential Artists and Songs from Old Time to Honky-Tonk, 1920 to 1970. When it comes to...
It's a subtitle, isn't it? It had a lot of data to be packed in.
Well, and there's a lot in the book, and I wanted to ask you, when it comes to finding recordings of these old artists, have a lot of them survived over the years, or are we still maybe discovering, old 78s in people's barns and stuff like that?
Yes and yes. A lot of them did survive. The ones that were hit recordings, say Patsy Montana's song, I Want to Be a Cowboy's Sweetheart, or Roy Acuff's Wabash Cannonball. These are not rare records. You still can turn them up in flea markets and estate sales and elderly people's record collections fairly commonly. On the other hand, there are stupendously rare records of which, fewer than 5 copies are known. There are still some records which nobody has ever discovered. We know they existed from old catalogues, but nobody's ever actually turned up a copy. Because as you get into the deep years of the Depression, these records were being pressed not as they once were in tens or hundreds of thousands, but in dozens in some case. We know of one stupendously rare record that I think 103 copies were pressed, of which, amazingly, 2 have survived to the present day from 1933. But there is a thriving community of record collectors going out, some of them passionately, every weekend to yard sales and estate sales, antiques barns, just combing their area, and sometimes on longer trips combing several states for old records. And there's a community united by, through the internet of people who do this regularly and share the news of what they're finding and, upload the songs themselves so that you can hear recordings that maybe you've never come across before.
Yeah, that's always great when somebody who finds some of these rare records is willing to put it up for everyone else to enjoy and to kind of archive it instead of maybe just keeping it in a box or someplace in the attic forever.
Yeah, there have been characters like that who were secretive, shall we say? But no, it's a lovely spirit. There was an old generation of record collectors who were pretty eccentric, some of them, but the current generation of record collectors in their 20s and 30s and 40s, many of whom I'm very happy to know, are much more generous with it, and also much more liberal about what they collect. I mean, the old timers would collect just jazz or just blues or just country music, but these younger guys, they go out and they will get ethnic records, Swedish American records, Irish American records. Their tastes are very wide, and so they're saving all kinds of stuff, some of which is paralyzingly rare, and it's wonderful that somebody recognizes what these things are when they see them and makes a point of saving them from dissolution.
Well, with the access that people have now, do you think younger generations, are they starting to go back and maybe find a new appreciation for some of these early artists?
Well, I hope so, because one of the things that the expansion of interest in old-time country music has done it's made possible, for example, the Bear Family record sets that you referred to earlier, devoted to old location sessions in Bristol, Tennessee, and Johnson City and Knoxville. Those wouldn't have been possible 20 years earlier. There just wouldn't have been a market for it. But since everybody in the world that I'm inhabiting, the musical world I'm inhabiting, everybody is more attuned to what was put on record back in the day. There is something like a market to make these things happen. Also, I should have said, a lot of these younger collectors are themselves musicians, and they buy not only because they enjoy finding old records, but because they like learning from them. And when you get gatherings of such people, as occasionally happens, it's not just people staring at old shellac discs and muttering about the condition, but people playing the songs that they have learned from those discs, and that's lovely because the whole living quality of old-time country music, the perpetual quality, if you like, is borne out by this constant rediscovery and reinvention.
Well, Tony, you touched on it a little bit earlier, but I wanted to ask you your thoughts, I guess, on where country music is now and where it's gone. I mean, it's definitely different than, the sounds of a Hank Williams or a Riley Puckett or someone like that.
Yes, it is. And I'm honestly, Dustin, I'm not evading the question. I'm just not qualified to, sit in judgment on most, or indeed probably any current country artists. I don't know them well because, I have, my time is adequately taken up. Thank you. Listening to the music of the first half of the history of country music. I do sense that a certain kind of spontaneity has gone out of the music. And in particular, something has necessarily disappeared from the music as the music industry and the record industry became more and more central to the survival of any kind of music, country music, rhythm and blues, whatever. But in the early days, a lot of the times, the people who were making the recordings, I mean, the producers, didn't really know what they were dealing with. They weren't Southerners themselves. They were moving in an unfamiliar territory, coming to Atlanta and recording a lot of local artists, many of them playing music that the recording men, would never have heard before. And so they made what we would now think of as wonderful mistakes. They signed up and recorded people who were extremely interesting, plainly would never have sold, a lot of records, but it's wonderful that we have those records. And that quality of being able to make a few mistakes along with scoring success with Jimmy Rogers or the Carter Family. The modern industry does not have room for that, for somebody just puckishly going out into going down to Nashville, say, and hauling in a whole lot of people who he or she likes, but, who don't necessarily have any kind of marketing potential. So, there's, as I say, that kind of accidental quality, if you like, of a lot of early recorded country music. The sense that how on earth did that person get from here to there to make a record, and how did the people making the record make the choice of him or her as somebody worth putting out on a national record label? Quite often you simply can't see the chain of reasoning that explains all that. And I love that quality, because it means that serendipitously we have all sorts of examples of singers and musicians and songs that under a tighter regime, shall we say, might never have got onto record, and we wouldn't have them today.
Sure. Well, Tony, I know Vintage Country is just out here. You're always busy. I know you're always working on something. Is there another project maybe coming up, or something we should be looking out for?
Yeah, very soon. I shall be next month in early November in Asheville, North Carolina, for the launch of a project that I and my frequent collaborator, Ted Olson from East Tennessee State University, have been engaged on for the last year or so, which is a CD and accompanying booklet of recordings made exactly 100 years ago this year, 1925, in Asheville, which was the first ever location recording session in Appalachia. And wow. A momentous occasion. It included people who were well known, like Ernest Stoneman, and fairly well known like Kelly Harrell, whom I mentioned earlier, and utterly obscure, and the notorious blackface yodeler Emmett Miller. It was a very interesting session, and we put together this selection for a CD, and that's going to be launched in Asheville. And in a couple of years' time, Ted and I will be doing the same thing, another centenary job, as you might say, in 2027, celebrating a 1927 session in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, also of country musicians, both famous and obscure, and another one of the relatively rare recording sessions held in Appalachia back in the day.
Wonderful. Well, definitely, I hope I get a chance to check those out. And again, Vintage Country, definitely a fascinating book, and the work that you put into this is astounding. And Tony, it's been great speaking with you. I really hope we can speak again sometime. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dustin.
And again, that was country music historian Tony Russell, and his latest book, Vintage Country, The Essential Artists and Songs from Old Time to Honky-Tonk, 1920 to 1970, is out now.